He thought he was just finishing a quiet meal alone, until 7 children appeared, thin shivering and politely asking, "May we have your leftovers, sir?" But it wasn't the hunger that broke him. It was what one little girl whispered next. "Daddy, sometimes what shatters us isn't pain. It's the sudden, overwhelming possibility of healing. If stories like this move, you don't forget to subscribe. You're not just joining a channel, you're joining a community that believes in second chances, quiet heroes, and the miracle of kindness." Now let me tell you a story you'll never forget. The snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes, covering the Wyoming roadside diner like a soft white blanket. Inside, the warm glow of neon lights flickered against the window glass, catching the reflection of a man hunched over a half-eaten sandwich. He looked like someone who had forgotten how to sit still, or maybe someone who'd learned to sit still so the pain wouldn't catch up. Hank Sullivan, 39, ex-cavalry single father, or at least he used to be. He didn't come to this roadside diner for the food. He came for the silence, the kind that let the ghosts breathe around him without talking back. He tore off another piece of the turkey sandwich and chewed slowly, eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. It was quiet today, aside from the clink of forks, the low murmur of a country song playing from the jukebox, and the hum of an old coffee machine. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a bun pinned too tight, refilled his mug without asking. "You want a to-go box for the rest?" "Han," she asked, glancing at the half sandwich left untouched. "No," Hank said, his voice low and hoarse. "Let it go." He dropped a few crumpled bills on the table, adjusted the worn leather jacket slung across his shoulder, and left the booth without looking back. He'd parked his truck across the lot. Snow had already coated the windshield. He climbed in, started the engine, but then realized something was missing. His phone. He muttered a curse and opened the truck door again, boots crunching against the ice-packed snow as he hurried back into the diner. He pushed open the door and stopped cold. There, outside the window to his left, were 7 little girls huddled beneath the overhang of the diner's roof. They couldn't have been older than 10, the youngest, maybe 4 or 5. Dirty coats, mismatched scarves, faces smudged with road dust or soot, Hank couldn't tell which. What he did see with soul-shattering clarity was what lay between them on a torn piece of napkin. His leftover sandwich now split into 7 tiny pieces, one for each girl. They didn't speak. They didn't laugh. They weren't playing. They were surviving. One girl chewed slowly, closing her eyes, as if tasting something sacred. Another held her piece close to her chest, like a treasure she didn't yet dare eat. And then one of them looked up. Her eyes met Hank's through the glass. Blue. Wide. Frightened, but clear. Her lips parted just slightly, and though the glass muffled the sound, Hank didn't need to hear it to understand what she said. "Daddy," his breath caught. A punch couldn't have knocked the wind out of him faster. The door creaked behind him. The waitress appeared at his side holding his phone. "Left this on the table." "You all right?" Hank didn't answer. He couldn't. Something inside him had cracked wide open. He turned back toward the girls. The one who'd spoken, or thought she did, was still watching him, her small fingers trembling as she held her piece of sandwich. He opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The cold hit him instantly, but he hardly noticed. He approached them cautiously, like one would approach a wounded animal. Hands visible, voice soft. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. No answer. "Where did you come from? The oldest, perhaps?" 9 stepped in front protectively. She didn't speak, but her posture was clear. She was the mother now. "I'm not here to hurt you," Hank said as his voice cracked. "I just want to know if you're safe." Still no answer. But another girl, slightly younger, tugged at the coat of the eldest and whispered something into her ear. The eldest nodded, then reached into the inside of her jacket and handed Hank a folded piece of paper. It was wrinkled, smudged, nearly falling apart. On it was a photograph, 7 girls standing with a woman in army green scrubs, written on the back in faded ink. If anything happens to me, find the man with the sad eyes but a kind heart. He once saved me. He'll know what to do. Hank's hands trembled. He flipped the paper over again. The woman in the photo, he knew her. Grace Whitaker. She'd been a volunteer nurse during a medical outreach mission on the U.S.-Mexico border. There'd been a car accident. Hank had pulled her from a burning van, barely conscious. He'd carried her to safety. She'd cried in his arms, thanking him. He hadn't heard from her since. Now somehow her children, adopted, abandoned, rescued, were sitting in front of him, eating his sandwich in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of nowhere. Why did she call me Daddy? Hank whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The girl, the one with the blue eyes, stepped forward. She reached into the pocket of her coat and held out a tiny object in her hand. A hair clip. Blue. Plastic. Butterfly-shaped. Hank took a step back. It was the exact same kind his daughter Lily had worn the day he last saw her alive. The moment slammed into him with the force of a freight train. He fell to his knees. The snow soaked through his jeans, but he didn't care. His breath came in short gasps, not from the cold, but from something deeper, a soul unthawing. He looked at the 7 girls, all watching him quietly, trusting him, needing him. And for the first time in 2 years, he didn't run. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the Wyoming town in eerie stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Hank remained on his knees in front of the 7 little girls, his breath fogging in the icy air, the butterfly hair clip still cradled in his trembling hand. The children stood in a half-circle, saying nothing. No tears, no panic. Just quiet, watching like they were waiting to see who he'd become next. The oldest girl stepped forward. She was thin, her cheeks hollow freckles buried beneath dirt and cold, but her gaze was steady, protective. Hank noticed how she subtly shifted her body in front of the smallest girl, the one with the clip. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low. Where's Grace?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the folds of her oversized coat and pulled out a folded envelope. It was addressed in tight, careful handwriting. "To Hank Sullivan, if they find you." He stared at it as if it might explode in his hands. Slowly, reverently, he opened it. "Dear Hank, if you're reading this, I'm either dead or in a place where I can't be found. I never forgot you. Not after Mexico. You saved my life, and I said, if I ever got the chance, I'd save someone else's. These girls, they saved me first. Every one of them was forgotten by governments, families, systems too broken to notice them. I found them. I loved them. I was trying to adopt all 7 officially when the hurricane hit. I don't know if I'll make it out. I don't know if they will. But if they do, and they make it to you, please don't send them back into the system. The system forgets them. You won't. You've known loss, Hank. Maybe that's why you'll understand. These girls don't need saving. They need someone to stay. You don't have to be a hero. Just stay. With hope. Grace." Hank folded the letter slowly, as if it might disintegrate in his fingers. The girl still stood before him, her expression unchanging. Behind her, the others began to shiver, not from fear, but from the biting wind that had picked up again. The smallest one coughed a dry, rattling sound that hit Hank like a blade to the chest. He stood up. His knees cracked under the cold. He looked at the diner, then at the truck, then back to the girls. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's get you warm." He led them to the truck, helping the smallest 2 climb up first. The inside was barely warmer, but it was shelter. As they sat huddled in a row across the back seat and the narrow space behind it, Hank started the engine. The heater coughed, sputtered, then hummed. "Names?" he asked, glancing at the rearview mirror. Silence. Then the oldest girl spoke just one word. "Emmy." A few moments later, a second voice, softer Piper. Then Hazel. Ruby. Violet. Ivy. And finally the blue-eyed girl with the clip pressed to her chest. June. June. The name rang through Hank like a bell. He stared ahead through the windshield, fogged with breath, snow streaking the glass like time itself had melted into memory. Back at his rental cabin on the edge of town, Hank moved in silence. He unlocked the door, stepped aside, and let the girls shuffle in. The place was sparse, just a fireplace, 2 rooms, a couch, and a tiny kitchen. He hadn't cared much about decoration or warmth. Now it mattered. He knelt and started a fire. The girls sat cross-legged on the floor, arms wrapped around each other. No one asked for anything. "Sit tight," he said, opening the kitchen cabinets. Canned beans, saltines, 2 apples. Not enough for 7. He heated the beans anyway, dividing them into mismatched mugs. He handed each one out carefully, watching how the girls took their portions, with reverence, like this was more than food. Like it was a sign that they were still alive. When June received hers, she didn't eat right away. She simply held the warm mug in her lap, looking down into it, as if it held answers. Then she looked up at Hank and offered him the first spoonful. He almost lost it again. "Why me?" he whispered aloud, not meaning to. Why now June didn't speak. She reached out gently and placed her hand over his. Her palm was cold, small, fragile. But the gesture anchored something in him that had been drifting for far too long. Later that night, after the girls had fallen asleep in a bundle of blankets on the floor, all except Emmy, who sat near the fireplace keeping watch, Hank stood outside the cabin staring into the night. Snowflakes landed on his lashes. He didn't blink. Grace's letter was folded in his coat pocket. So was the butterfly clip. His mind spun, searching for reason for explanation. 7 girls, a hurricane, a letter, a familiar name from a past he'd buried. Then the door creaked. Emmy stepped out, wrapping a blanket tighter around her thin shoulders. "We won't stay long," she said. Her voice was firm, almost too old for her years. "You're not leaving," Hank replied. "We've left everywhere," she said. "No one keeps us." Hank turned to her. The firelight from inside cast a soft glow on her face. "I didn't keep my daughter either," he said. "I know what it means to live with that." Emmy looked at him, then really looked, and in her gaze he saw it a flicker of trust, too weary to fully emerge, but present nonetheless. "She used to have a clip like that," he added. "Blue butterfly. June found it at a shelter months ago," Emmy whispered. "She said it was special." "It was," Hank said. "It still is." They stood in silence together side by side until Emmy finally whispered, "We'll try to stay." And Hank, for the first time in 2 years, didn't feel like running. The Wyoming dawn rose gray and bitterly quiet, muffled beneath a crust of snow that turned the world pale and still. The cold crept into everything, floorboards, windowsills, bones. But inside Hank Sullivan's cabin, something had shifted. It wasn't the heat from the fireplace or the faint scent of warm beans still lingering in the air. It was the presence of breath of bodies curled close for warmth of life. Hank stood at the kitchen sink, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, steam rising from the coffee like a whisper he couldn't decipher. He hadn't slept. Not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's face superimposed with June's. The same blue eyes, the same silence, the same weight of unspoken need. Behind him, the girls began to stir. Blankets rustled. Tiny coughs broke the silence. A yawn, then like clockwork. Emmy was the first to rise, moving quietly to check on each sister, pressing her hand to foreheads, adjusting socks, folding a blanket that had slipped to the floor. Hank watched from the kitchen, quietly awed. There was a moment, fleeting and sharp, when he saw a soldier in her, not in uniform but in posture, in the way she carried the others, the way she carried herself. He cleared his throat. Bathrooms down the hall to the left. I'll get some more food. Emmy turned toward him. We're okay. No, you're not, Hank said. Not unkindly. But you will be. The town was still half asleep when Hank pulled up to the small market on Main Street. The store owner Earl was sweeping slush from the steps. Back early, Earl grunted. Unexpected house guests, Hank said. Earl eyed him, then looked into the back of Hank's truck, where several old blankets and coats were now piled. He said nothing, just stepped aside and opened the door. Inside, Hank grabbed essentials: bread, peanut butter, canned stew, baby aspirin just in case, and a pack of multivitamins. At checkout, Earl rang everything up slowly, then paused before reading the total. You okay? He asked, not looking up. Honestly, I don't know, Hank replied. Earl nodded once. Then, without another word, he reached behind the counter and added a small box of powdered hot chocolate. No charge, he said. Kids like chocolate. When Hank returned, the girls were gathered in a half circle around the fireplace, each holding handmade paper squares, scraps from his old notebooks. Piper was drawing a map in meticulous detail, Hazel writing something in tiny block letters, and Ruby folding hers into what looked like a swan. June, as usual, said nothing. She sat closest to the flames, knees tucked to her chest, hair falling across her face. Ivy, the youngest, coughed again, wet and hollow. Hank's eyes narrowed. He knelt beside her, one hand to her forehead. She running a fever, he asked Emmy. It goes up and down, Emmy said. We've had worse. Worse isn't acceptable, Hank said. She needs a doctor. Emmy straightened. If you take us to a hospital, they'll split us up. They don't always. They do, Emmy cut in her voice firm but not disrespectful. They tried once already. We got out. Grace said Hank started. She said you'd stay. Not turn us in. He stood slowly, the weight of responsibility landing squarely on his shoulders, like a rucksack he hadn't carried in years. I'm not turning you in, he said quietly. I don't know what I'm doing. Piper looked up from her map. That's okay. We do. That evening, after bowls of canned stew and bread with peanut butter, Hank sat on the front steps, watching dusk settle like ash over the landscape. He could see his own breath and hear the low murmur of voices inside. Then the door creaked, and June stepped out barefoot, wearing one of Hank's old flannel shirts that nearly swallowed her. He opened his mouth to scold her about the cold, but stopped when he saw her clutching something tightly in her hand. It was the drawing she'd made earlier, a sketch of a little girl holding a man's hand. They were standing in snow beneath a sun that hadn't yet broken the clouds. The man looked like Hank. The girl looked like her. She handed it to him silently. Is this us? He asked, throat thick. She nodded. He blinked hard. You think I'm her dad? June shook her head. His chest ached a little at the answer, until she pointed to the space between the two figures. There, between their hands, was a tiny heart. She wasn't calling him Dad. She was saying, you don't have to be my father. You're already something more. That night, after the girls were asleep, Hank pulled Grace's letter from his coat again. He read it under the dim lamplight, tracing each word like it might disappear. Then he flipped it over. There, scribbled faintly on the back in different handwriting, was a second message. If you find them, tell Ivy she's stronger than her lungs. Tell Piper she draws better maps than I ever could. Tell Emmy she doesn't have to carry the whole world. And tell June she doesn't need to speak to be heard. Hank folded the letter carefully, set it beside the butterfly clip on his nightstand, and lay back in bed. Sleep didn't come easy, but for the first time in 2 years, he wanted to dream again. The snow began to melt 2 days later, not with grace, but in thick slush that muddied everything in town, including Hank Sullivan's thoughts. The world outside was dripping, dripping, dripping. But inside the cabin, something else was quietly crystallizing. By now, the girls had settled into a strange rhythm, half feral, half domestic. They still slept in a pile on the floor, like a litter of cubs, but Emmy had begun organizing the pantry. Piper built a paper map of the surrounding woods, using envelopes and an old road atlas. Hank hadn't touched in years. Hazel had found a dusty box of children's books under the coffee table and was reading aloud every afternoon, even if no one listened. They never asked how long they could stay. They never asked Hank if he wanted them there. But something had shifted the night June gave him her drawing, and Hank, who had once built walls tighter than military protocol, was starting to feel the cracks. He heard himself saying things like, "Careful with that," or "Finish your soup," and one afternoon he caught himself humming. He couldn't remember the last time he'd hummed. That evening, as dusk lowered across the ridgeline and the wind sighed through the pines, Hank sat alone at the kitchen table with Grace's letter spread out in front of him. He'd read it at least 20 times. But tonight he noticed something different, a faint imprint on the bottom margin, almost invisible. He tilted the paper toward the lamplight, then carefully rubbed a pencil over it, a trick Lily used to use with treasure maps. And there it was, a second note, lightly pressed. Not from Grace this time, but from Piper. "If you find this, please find Grace. Silver Pine Clinic, south of Boulder, Colorado. She said that's where she'd go. She promised. We believe her." "I do." P. Hank sat back in his chair, his heart thudding. He looked toward the living room where the girls were curled like commas beneath patched quilts. Ivy coughed in her sleep, a small wheezing sound that twisted something deep in his chest. He stood up. By morning, the decision was made. He would take them south, to Colorado, to Silver Pine, wherever that was. He would find Grace if she was alive. And if she wasn't, he would make sure the girls knew he'd tried. He found Emmy outside gathering firewood with Hazel and Ruby, their boots soaked from snowmelt hands red and raw. When he told her his plan, she said nothing at first. Then, "You're serious. As serious as anything I've ever done." She stared at him, testing the resolve in his face like she'd done the first night. Finally, she nodded. "Okay. But we don't want charity." "This isn't charity," Hank said. "It's a second chance." Over the next 48 hours, Hank made preparations like he was heading out on deployment. He cleaned out the old delivery van he hadn't driven in months, the one with chipped paint and rust along the doors, but with just enough seats to make it work. He stocked water blankets, a first aid kit, flashlights, canned food. Ruby helped label everything, taking great pride in her wobbly handwriting. June, silent as ever, packed the butterfly clip into a tiny tin and slid it into Hank's jacket pocket. Ivy's condition was getting worse. Her cough had turned wet and deep, and though she tried to smile, her strength was fading. Hank placed her on the front seat beside him, wrapped in his army jacket. The drive south was long and uneven. They avoided main roads, taking winding back highways, through forests, past thawing creeks and frozen farms. At night, they slept in the van under layers of blankets. In the mornings, Piper reviewed the map, while Emmy checked Ivy's pulse, like a medic trained by survival. Hazel sang softly to Ivy each night, lullabies Hank hadn't heard since Lily's bedtime. On the third day, after hours of driving, they stopped at a gas station. As the girls used the restroom one by one, Hank stood at the window, looking at the Rockies in the distance. That's when an old man shuffled past him and said, "She yours?" Hank blinked. "Who, the little one with the butterfly clip? She looks at you like she's known you her whole life." Hank didn't reply. He just watched June through the glass, sitting on the curb beside Piper, tracing patterns in the slush with a stick. "She don't talk?" the man asked. "No," Hank said. "She listens. Sometimes that's the better skill." The man shuffled away. That night, after parking near a trailhead outside Fort Collins, Hank stepped out for air. The moon hung low, a yellow coin above the tree line. He couldn't sleep. His chest was tight. The guilt came like it always did, sudden, sharp, merciless. Lily's face. The way she reached for him before the accident, the way he'd missed her last birthday. He could hear her voice like wind through pine. "You didn't stay, Daddy." He pressed his palms against the hood of the van, bent over, trying to breathe. Then a hand touched his elbow. June. She stood there in her socks, holding a crumpled drawing. She unfolded it and showed it to him. 2 stick figures. A girl with a butterfly clip. A man with tears falling from his eyes. In the sky above them, written in uneven block letters, "Stay." Hank swallowed hard. "I'm trying," he whispered. June reached out, placed the drawing in his hand, and stepped forward. She leaned against him, not a hug, not quite, just leaning. Trusting. And in that moment, in the cold and dark, Hank finally felt it. He belonged to someone again. Not because of blood, not because of obligation, because of choice. The sun rose soft and golden over the Colorado foothills, casting long shadows across the frost-lined highway. The van groaned as it moved uphill, tires grinding against patches of melting snow and gravel. Inside, the warmth from bundled bodies and shared breath kept the chill at bay. The girls had developed a strange sort of harmony, not noisy, not quiet either. Just a rhythm. Piper sat shotgun, now her map splayed across her lap, correcting Hank when he missed a turn. Ruby and Hazel played word games in the back, inventing new names for animals they spotted out the window. Emmy kept one eye on Ivy, whose cough had worsened in the night. And June, sweet silent. June was curled beside Hank's jacket, sketching something unseen. They had become a unit. A living, breathing constellation, 7 stars trying to stay lit. Hank hadn't meant to care this much. That was the thing about real responsibility. It didn't ask for permission. It just crept in 1 cup of soup, 1 check on a forehead, 1 whispered, "Thank you," until it wrapped around you and wouldn't let go. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Ivy's small frame trembled beneath the flannel blanket. Her lips had turned slightly blue. That was new and terrifying. He clenched the steering wheel tighter. "We'll stop in Boulder," he said aloud. "Hospital first, then Silver Pine." Piper looked up from the map. "You said no hospitals." "I said no splitting you up," Hank corrected. "But Ivy needs help, real help. We'll figure it out." Emmy leaned forward. "What if they try to take her? Then they'll have to get through me," Hank said. And though his voice was calm, something hard and sharp edged it. They pulled into Boulder just after noon. The parking lot outside the urgent care clinic was half full. It smelled of exhaust and old pine needles. Hank scooped Ivy into his arms and carried her inside her breath, shallow, her forehead burning. The nurse at the front desk gave him a look, the kind that carried questions, 7 girls. 1 man, no paperwork. But Hank didn't flinch. "She has a congenital heart condition," he said plainly. "She's burning up. Do your job." That was enough. They whisked Ivy away into a sterile white room, while the others waited outside in the van. Emmy insisted. "We stay together," she said. "Always." An hour passed, then 2. When Hank returned to the van, the girls huddled in anticipation. "She's stable," he said. "They're giving her oxygen, fluids, monitoring her for pneumonia. We can see her in the morning." Relief hit the group like a wave. Ruby wiped her eyes. Hazel whispered a prayer. June reached for Hank's hand. He didn't pull away. That night, they checked into a rundown roadside motel. The kind where the lights flicker and the heat clunks like an old machine ready to give up. But it had 2 beds, a small sofa, and a microwave, which to the girls might as well have been luxury. Hank ran a bath and let them take turns soaking in the hot water. He tossed their worn clothes into the laundry downstairs, leaving the girls in oversized t-shirts from the motel's lost and found box. At midnight, the room was dim, lit only by the glow of the TV on mute. Old cartoons flickered, while 6 girls slept in a tangle of limbs and blankets. Hank sat at the edge of the bed, leafing through Grace's letter again. Piper stirred. "You think she's really there?" she whispered. Hank looked over. "Grace." She nodded. "She promised," he said. "So did my real mom," Piper replied. "But people break promises." He didn't answer right away. "Then yeah, they do. But not always." Piper studied him. "You broke one too, didn't you?" Hank inhaled slowly. "I missed my daughter's birthday. I said I'd be there, and I wasn't. I was off doing something I thought mattered more at the time. She died." He nodded. "She forgive you, I don't know," he whispered. "But I forgive me. Some days." In the morning, they returned to the clinic. Ivy was sitting up pale but alert, a pink knit hat on her head and a popsicle in her hand. "She's responding well," the nurse explained. "You got her here just in time." "You, her dad." Hank hesitated. "No," he said. Then, after a breath, "But I'm not leaving either." The nurse smiled. "That's the part that counts." An hour later, with Ivy bundled in fresh blankets and Piper navigating again, they resumed their journey toward Silver Pine. The road narrowed as they climbed. Pine trees crowded the shoulders, their needles whispering secrets to the wind. A river curled beside them like a silver ribbon. June slid a folded paper into Hank's lap. He opened it while driving. A drawing crude but clear. 7 girls, a van, a cabin, a woman in a wheelchair beside a fire, and above it, in childlike scrawl, "We found her." Hank blinked. "We're not there yet," he said quietly. June pointed at his heart. Then the drawing. And Hank understood. They were closer than they'd ever been. The mountains deepened around them, rising like silent sentinels, as the road narrowed into curves, sharp enough to make even the river run cautiously beside it. The van climbed higher into the Colorado wilderness, the forest thickening, the air thinning. Hank felt it before he saw it. The storm rolling in from the west, slow and heavy. The clouds hung low, smeared like ash across the peaks. Light flurries had started to fall again, tapping softly against the windshield, like fingers of warning. They were 20 miles from Silver Pine Clinic, 20 miles from Grace if she was still there, 20 miles from whatever was supposed to happen next. In the back, Ivy coughed again, a tight barking sound that sent Hank's eyes darting to the rearview mirror. She looked better than she had 2 days ago, but still fragile, like a flame that could go out with one strong breath. Piper watched the road signs like a hawk. Emmy sat beside Ivy, murmuring something soft and steady. Ruby and Hazel huddled under a shared blanket. And June, always. June sat closest to the sliding door drawing. She never stopped drawing. Hank gripped the wheel tighter. Then the snow came hard. The wind picked up like a growl, shaking the van with each gust. Visibility dropped within minutes. What had been trees and cliffs and winding roads became a wall of white. The tires slipped once then again, and Hank knew he had to stop. They spotted it together, an old fire watch cabin tucked half off the road, behind a weather-worn sign that read, U.S. Forest Service. Emergency shelter. It looked abandoned. Probably was. But the roof held, the walls were up, and a small woodpile sat protected under the porch. It would do. Hank parked the van, close grabbed the flashlight, and helped the girls inside one by one. June clung to his coat, her little hand curled tightly into his. Inside, the air was stale but dry. A rusted stove stood in the corner. Cots lined the wall. Rodents had left signs of past visits, but none were present now. It wasn't warm, but it was safe. "We're staying here tonight," Hank announced. Nobody protested. By dusk, Hank had a fire going. The girls peeled off their wet layers and laid them across chairs to dry. Ruby and Hazel found a battered deck of cards in a drawer. Emmy checked Ivy's breathing every hour, and June sat beside Hank, watching the fire not drawing for once. It felt still, like something sacred had settled over them all. Then, in the hush between logs shifting in the stove and the whimpering wind, Emmy spoke. "We didn't tell you everything she said." Hank looked up. "What do you mean?" Emmy's eyes met his, steady but softer than before. "About Grace, about how we ended up with her." Piper stirred in her cot. Hazel sat up slowly. Even June turned to listen. "She wasn't just a nurse," Emmy said. "She used to find us kids like us. She said people had a way of looking right through children who didn't cry loud enough." Hank nodded, silent. "She met each of us in different places. I was in a shelter near El Paso. Piper came from a hurricane camp in Louisiana. Ivy was left outside a hospital at night, with a note pinned to her coat." Piper added, "Grace called us her found girls, like pieces of her heart scattered across the country." June rose, then moving to the center of the room. She knelt by the fire, pulled something from her coat, and unwrapped it carefully, a photograph, worn and crumpled edges curling with time. 7 girls. Grace behind them, hands on shoulders, smiling like the sun. "Ivy doesn't remember it," Emmy said. "She was too little. But Grace promised us if we ever got lost, we'd find each other again. That's why we stayed together. That's why we came looking." Hank looked at the picture. He'd seen it before, folded in Grace's letter. But here in June's hands it felt alive. He looked around the cabin. 7 little girls wrapped in blankets, a storm howling outside, and the weight of someone else's promise now resting fully on him. "Do you believe she's still there?" he asked. Hazel answered this time, "We have to." The fire dimmed as the night grew colder. Hank took first watch, letting the girls sleep. He sat with the photo in his hand and Grace's letter in his pocket. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. He remembered every word now. These girls don't need saving. They need someone to stay. Stay. The word echoed louder than the wind. His mind drifted back to a hotel room in Austin years ago, the night he missed Lily's last birthday. He'd been attending a benefit dinner for veterans, something that seemed noble, necessary. He remembered her face when he called disappointed small. He remembered saying, "Next time, sweetheart." I promise, there hadn't been a next time. The storm raged on. In the middle of the night, Ivy began to cry out, a fever dream or pain Hank couldn't tell. Emmy rushed to her side, whispering comfort, cooling her forehead with a damp cloth. Hank rose, moved to her quickly, and knelt beside them both. "She's burning again," Emmy said, voice tight. June appeared with the canteen. Hazel wrapped another blanket over Ivy's feet. Piper started humming a lullaby. Ruby fetched socks from the van. No one panicked. They moved like a unit, like a family. And Hank, for the first time, didn't hesitate. He sat beside Ivy, cradling her head in his lap, stroking her damp hair. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes fluttered open just long enough to meet his. "Daddy," she rasped, barely a breath. He leaned down, lips trembling. "I'm here." Her tiny hand closed around his finger. "Stay," she whispered. He nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the storm began to ease. Inside the cabin, 7 girls slept once again. But now Hank didn't feel like a man carrying someone else's promise. He felt like someone becoming the promise himself. The storm passed quietly, as if it had said all it needed to say. When morning came, the world outside the cabin was still untouched. Snow glittered across the trees, painting the forest in silver and forgiveness. Hank stood at the edge of the cabin's porch, breathing in the sharp mountain air. Behind him, the girls were waking slowly, stretching beneath their blankets. Ivy was already sitting up, color returning to her cheeks. She waved sleepily when she saw him watching. He smiled and waved back. They were close now. Hank could feel it. And not just to Silver Pine, to something else, to something whole. The last leg of the drive was quiet. No games, no songs, just the hum of the engine and the collective heartbeat of 7 souls bound together by choice. Silver Pine Clinic wasn't marked by a grand entrance. There was no gate, no sign with flowers. Just a modest, single-story building tucked against the mountainside, its beige exterior faded, but cared for. A long wooden ramp led to the front door, flanked by pine trees heavy with snow. Hank pulled the van into a gravel lot and turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. No one moved. Then June leaned forward from the back seat and placed her drawing, the one with the cabin, the fire, and a woman in a wheelchair, onto Hank's lap. It was time. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and something warmer, cinnamon maybe. A receptionist with gray curls and kind eyes looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" Hank swallowed. "I'm looking for Grace Whitaker. I was told she might be here." The woman tilted her head slightly. "And you are Hank Sullivan." The woman studied him for a beat. Then she stood without a word and walked down the hallway. A moment later, a nurse appeared, early 30s, neat ponytail, clipboard in hand. "She's here," the nurse said softly. "But it's complicated." "What do you mean she was injured last year?" "Spinal trauma, partial paralysis. She's been in our long-term rehab unit since August. Cognitively, she's sharp. Emotionally, it depends." Hank looked back at the girls waiting near the door, their faces pressed against the glass, too nervous to come in. "She's not expecting this," he said. The nurse smiled. "No one ever expects the miracle that's coming for them." The room was small and filled with morning light. Grace sat in a wheelchair by the window, her auburn hair streaked with gray, but her posture still regal. Her hands rested motionless in her lap. Her eyes stared out into the snow, distant and still. She turned slightly when she heard the door open, her breath caught. Hank stepped in slowly, cautiously. At first she said nothing. Her eyes scanned his face like a memory, long buried, rising to the surface. "Hank," she whispered. He nodded, voice tight. "Yeah, it's me." Tears welled instantly. "I thought you were a dream," she said, voice breaking. "I wrote that letter, thinking no one would ever find it." "They did," he replied gently. "They found me, and they brought your hope with them." She looked behind him, and at that moment Emmy stepped in. Then Piper, Hazel, Ruby, June, and finally Ivy, wrapped in Hank's coat. All 7. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth, her body trembling. The tears came hard, silent and real. "They're alive," she gasped. "All of them." She reached out instinctively, forgetting for one fractured second that her legs no longer worked. Emmy crossed the room first, kneeling by her side. We kept each other safe. We followed the map. Piper remembered the roads. Ivy stayed brave. "I broke my promise," Grace whispered. "I was supposed to come back for you." June stepped forward and gently placed her butterfly clip in Grace's hand. "You did," Hank said. "You just didn't do it alone." They stayed for hours. Stories poured out in bursts and whispers. Grace listened, laughed, wept, and held each of them in turn with her eyes, if not her arms. Hank stayed in the corner, at first unsure of his place. But as the day faded and shadows stretched across the room, Grace turned to him. "You've changed," she said softly. "So have you." "No," she replied. "You let people in. That's the rare kind of change." He smiled. "You trusted them with that letter. That matters." Grace lowered her voice. Do you still carry the guilt, Hank? He hesitated, then nodded. Then let me say something I should have said a long time ago, she said, looking him dead in the eye. You don't owe the past anything, but you owe the present everything. He sat beside her, and for the first time in years he believed her. Later that night, after the girls had been tucked into borrowed beds and Ivy was being monitored in the clinic's pediatric room, Grace and Hank sat on the front porch watching the snow fall again. She never spoke, Hank said, glancing toward the door. Not a single word, until the shelter. Grace nodded. June has a kind of grief that speaks louder without sound. But don't underestimate her silence. She says what others are too afraid to. She saved me, Hank whispered. They all did. Grace looked at him for a long moment. So, what now? I don't know, he admitted. But for the first time in a long time, I want to stay long enough to find out. Grace smiled. You already did. The first morning at Silver Pine Clinic broke with birdsong and the soft clang of breakfast trays. Frost still clung to the windows, but the tension that had lived in the girls' shoulders seemed to melt overnight. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, they weren't looking over their shoulders. They were home, at least for now. Hank sat at a small cafeteria table sipping weak coffee and watching from a distance as Hazel tried to teach Ruby how to use a plastic spoon without catapulting oatmeal across the room. Emmy organized packets of sugar like she was filing reports. June sat beside Grace's wheelchair, holding her hand in silence. Piper, ever alert, had found the clinic's bulletin board and was already sketching an updated evacuation route with the markers she'd found. Ivy, still recovering, napped under a blanket with her tiny hand resting on her chest, breathing slow and steady. Grace smiled at the scene. They're still a little feral, she murmured to Hank. They're perfect, he said. She turned to look at him. You know this can't be temporary anymore. I know. Grace's expression softened. Do you want to talk to them first, or should I? Hank exhaled long and slow. We'll do it together. That afternoon, the girls gathered in the sunroom, a space lined with tall windows and worn bookshelves. Ivy curled up in Grace's lap, while the others sat on cushions or the floor, forming a loose circle. Hank stood awkwardly at first. His fingers fidgeted with the hem of his flannel shirt. Then he cleared his throat and looked at them. Really looked. 7 faces. 7 stories. 7 small, powerful hearts that had survived more than most adults he knew. I didn't expect any of this, he began. Not the diner, not the sandwich, not you. The girls were quiet, listening. Before I met you, I was... He searched for the word. Frozen. I lost someone. My daughter, Lily. And for a long time I thought if I stayed still enough, the pain would just pass by. He paused. But it didn't. It stayed. Until you came along. Ivy lifted her head. Are we... your new daughters? Now, Hank smiled gently. If you'll have me. Emmy glanced at Piper. Hazel's eyes welled. June reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. She handed it to Hank. Inside was a drawing, crude, like always, but powerful. It showed Hank at the center, 7 tiny hearts surrounding him. One heart had wings. Lily. He swallowed hard. Grace wheeled herself closer. Girls, she said gently, this doesn't mean everything will be easy. There will still be paperwork, doctors, courts. But what matters most is the choice, Hazel whispered. Then we choose. Choose what Grace asked. Hazel stood. To stay. To be a family. One by one they nodded. Piper. Ivy. Ruby. Emmy. June. Each girl reached out and placed a hand over Hank's. He looked at the pile of small hands, so fragile, so fierce, and felt something anchor in him that had been drifting since the day Lily died. Over the following weeks, the clinic staff helped make arrangements. Hank filed for emergency guardianship with Grace's support. Legal aid volunteers, moved by the story, stepped in to streamline the process. Emmy, already wise beyond her years, helped explain forms to the younger girls and filled in missing gaps. Meanwhile, Hank took on the role he'd been avoiding for far too long, father. He wasn't perfect. He burned grilled cheese, forgot to pack extra socks, called Hazel by Ruby's name at least 3 times. But he learned. He learned how Piper liked her cereal warm, how Ruby had nightmares only when it rained, that June drew best when someone sat silently beside her, that Ivy could make anyone smile with a single dimpled grin. He learned what family meant when it wasn't bound by blood, but by staying. One evening, Emmy approached him alone in the hallway outside Grace's room. "You okay?" Hank asked. She nodded, then hesitated. "Do you still miss your daughter?" His heart twisted. Every day. Do we make it harder? He crouched to her level, resting a hand on her shoulder. "No. You make it possible. To remember her with love, not just pain." She looked down. "You said once you couldn't keep her." "I didn't," he admitted. "But I'm keeping you. All of you. And this time, I'm staying." Her eyes softened. "Then I forgive you. For her." He blinked hard. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come from the person you lost. Sometimes it comes from the one who's helping you live again. 2 weeks later, the clinic hosted a community open house, a small fundraiser and celebration. Grace gave a speech from her wheelchair, introducing the girls one by one to the crowd. Ivy, to everyone's surprise, recited a poem. Hazel sang. Piper showed her maps. Ruby danced a clumsy but joyful ballet in her socks. Then came June. She stepped to the front holding a fresh drawing. She turned it around. It showed a house, not a clinic, not a shelter. A real home with trees light and a front porch with 7 pairs of shoes lined neatly at the step. Above it, she'd written one word in thick, bold crayon: stay. The crowd erupted in gentle applause, and in the center of it all stood Hank. His arms crossed over his chest, tears on his face, and his heart finally wide open. The land sat on the edge of town, just past the old grain silos, where the roads turned from pavement to dust, and the wind carried the faint smell of pine and wood smoke. It had once been a small ranch, long abandoned, its barn collapsed inward, like a broken chest. The farmhouse leaned slightly to the left, one shutter hanging crooked. A for sale sign stood half buried in the overgrown grass, the ink long faded by time. To anyone else, it looked like a ruin. But to Hank, it looked like a beginning. He stood beside Grace in her wheelchair, both of them staring at the quiet property. "She's a mess," Grace said flatly. "She's got bones," Hank replied. Grace smiled. "That's what you said about yourself the first time I met you." He shrugged. Still true. Behind them, the girls tumbled out of the van, a storm of laughter and boots and mismatched jackets. Ivy clutched June's hand. Piper was already sketching the outline of the barn. Ruby found a rusted horseshoe and shouted. It's lucky Emmy inspected the porch steps, then immediately sat down to start a list. Hazel turned to Hank. "Is this ours?" He looked out over the field, the cracked windows, the half-fallen fence. Then he nodded. It will be. The idea had come during a late-night conversation between Grace and Hank, long after the clinic lights dimmed and the girls had gone to sleep. They needed more than temporary. They needed roots. And Grace had whispered, "What if we built something? For more than just us. A place for others like them, like the girls, like Hank, like every forgotten soul who ever needed someone to say, 'You can stay.'" So with Grace's modest savings, a quiet grant from the clinic's board, and a fundraiser launched by half the town, they bought the ranch and named it Lily House. Not for a flower, but for a little girl whose name would now mean home. The first month was dust and demolition. Hank worked from sunup to sundown. His hands blistered, his back sore, but his heart steady. Volunteers came, veterans. Hank had served with neighbors. Grace had helped even the town librarian, who brought peanut butter sandwiches and duct tape just in case. The girls worked too. Piper designed the layout for the new bunk room. Hazel organized the tool shed. Emmy kept a clipboard and assigned daily tasks. Ruby and June painted signs in bright colors. Hope lives here. Please remove muddy boots. Family inside. Ivy, still healing, sat on the porch with Grace and directed traffic like a general in a blanket cape. One morning, June handed Hank a sketch. The front porch finished, the light on 7 figures laughing. Above it, she had written a new word: home. Hank built Lily's bench, first a simple wooden seat beneath the lone elm tree out front. He carved her name into it with quiet hands and a full heart. When it was finished, he sat there alone for a long time. The girls found him eventually. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They just sat beside him one by one until the bench creaked under the weight of love reborn. In mid-autumn, after weeks of construction cleanup and endless hot cocoa, Lily House opened its doors, not just to the girls, but to others. 2 brothers from a nearby shelter arrived first. Then a teenage girl whose mother was in rehab. Then a grandmother and her grandson, who'd lost their trailer in a wildfire. There were no forms at the door, no judgment, only a question softly spoken by Emmy at every new arrival. Do you need to stay? If the answer was yes, they were home. One evening, Grace wheeled onto the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. She watched Hank help Ivy water the vegetable beds they'd started behind the barn. Ruby chased fireflies. Piper mapped the stars with Hazel. June sketched beneath the porch light. Emmy sat beside Grace, silent. "You've done something extraordinary," Grace said. Emmy shook her head. "We did." Grace smiled. "How do you feel?" Emmy looked out at the field. "Safe. Like maybe this time it won't get taken away." "It won't," Grace said firmly. "How can you be sure?" Grace pointed toward Hank. "He's not the man we found. He's the man who stayed." That night after dinner, the girls gathered around the fireplace. June pulled out a surprise, a framed drawing neatly inked. It showed Lily House, the porch light glowing the elm tree, and Bloom, the bench beneath it. 7 girls. Grace in her chair. Hank standing behind them, a hand on each shoulder. And just above the door, in bold block letters, "The family we chose." Hank stared at it for a long time. Then he stood, cleared his throat, and said, "I don't know how I got so lucky, but I do know one thing. They waited. I didn't just build this house for you. You built it for me. I thought I was rescuing you, but you were saving me." June nodded, her eyes shining. Piper whispered, "We knew." And Emmy, steady as ever, said, "We chose each other." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, as if even the forest had quieted to listen. Inside, the fire crackled. Laughter rose. And for the first time in years, everything and everyone stayed. Snow had returned, but this time it came softly. No longer a threat, but a grace note. A hush. The kind of snow that blankets the world in silence, not to bury it, but to bless it. At Lily House, the pine trees stood cloaked in white, twinkling with strands of second-hand lights. Ruby and Piper had spent a week untangling. The porch railing wore garlands woven from ribbon pine cones and good intentions. From the road, the house looked like something out of a storybook. But the real story was inside. Hank stood in the kitchen stirring hot cider on the stove, while Hazel and Ivy argued gently over the exact placement of the marshmallows in the cocoa mugs. Piper strung popcorn on thread, her fingers moving with the precision of a watchmaker. June sat on the floor by the tree, sketching each ornament, as if cataloging joy. Emmy and Grace had just returned from the clinic. Grace now stronger, more radiant, her wheelchair wrapped in a red knit blanket, courtesy of Ruby. The cold had turned Emmy's nose pink, but she moved through the room like a captain with wind at her back. They had made it, not just to December, to belonging. That evening, the dining table sagged beneath the weight of potluck. Generosity neighbors had brought pies, biscuits, glazed carrots, 3 kinds of stuffing, and a ham that took 2 men to carry in. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Someone had dusted off an old guitar and left it leaning against the wall. Ivy sat in Hank's lap, her head tucked under his chin. Her breathing had steadied her cheeks, flushed with warmth. She reached for his hand. "You think she can see us?" she asked softly, who Hank asked already knowing. "Lily," he swallowed, smiled. "I think she's in the middle of all of this." Ivy looked up. "Do you miss her even now? Especially now," he said. "But not with sadness anymore. With gratitude." "For what?" "For the reminder that love doesn't end." Ivy nodded like she understood more than a child ever should. After dinner, they stepped outside, all of them wrapped in scarves and mittens and layers of laughter. The backyard had been transformed. Piper and Hazel had designed a lantern path using mason jars, battery candles, and tiny sprigs of evergreen. The girls led the guests toward a circle of logs and stumps arranged around a bonfire pit. In the center stood a tree, tall, wild, not perfect, but real, just like them. Emmy raised a hand and called for quiet. "This tree," she said, "is for the ones we love, the ones we lost, the ones who never got to find a place like Lily House." She turned to Hank, handing him the first ornament, a wooden carving of a butterfly. He looked at it for a long moment, the firelight dancing in his eyes, then stepped forward and hung it on the lowest branch. "Her name was Lily," he said simply. Nothing else needed to be said. One by one, the others followed. Names were spoken, stories shared. Grace hung a star for her sister, who died before she ever saw Grace graduate nursing school. A quiet teenage boy who joined them 2 weeks earlier added a bead bracelet in memory of his grandfather. Ruby tied on a paper heart for the dog she once had for 3 days in a foster home before they sent her back. There were tears. There was laughter. And when it was done, the tree glowed with memory. The guitar reappeared later, its strings slightly out of tune but full of promise. Hank strummed a few chords, rusty, uncertain, then began to sing a song he once sang to Lily years ago. It wasn't perfect. His voice cracked once. But the girls joined in. Hazel kept time with a spoon on her knee. Grace hummed along, her voice warm and steady. The lyrics weren't famous, but they were theirs. "Stay, stay where the stars can see you. Stay, stay where the heart remembers. Even when the wind is cold and wild, love stays." In the smile of a child. He didn't make it through the final line. June stood and walked toward him. She touched his arm and leaned in, whispering something in his ear. He nodded. Then he stepped back, and for the first time ever, June faced the group and spoke aloud. Just one word. Home. The fire snapped in response, as if the world had been waiting for her voice. The crowd held its breath. Then erupted, not in applause, but in awe. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the girls had curled into blankets, Hank stood alone on the porch, gazing out at the glowing tree. Grace rolled up beside him. "You still afraid you don't deserve this?" she asked. He smiled, every now and then. But then June says one word and resets the entire universe. Grace reached for his hand. "You're not the man who broke. You're the man who rebuilt." He looked out at the yard, at the flickering lights, at the snow falling quiet as prayer. "I didn't rescue them," he said. "No," Grace agreed. "They rescued you." Then she glanced toward the stars, her voice just above a whisper. And maybe Lily, too. Inside the house, on the mantel above the fireplace, was a frame, the newest drawing from June. This one showed a circle of figures around a tree lit with stars. In the background, a house, a porch, a man with a guitar, and hovering just above them, all drawn in soft strokes of yellow and blue, a little girl with butterfly wings. Smiling, spring arrived in gentle breaths. The snow didn't melt so much as it surrendered, seeping into the roots of the earth, like a long-held secret, finally whispered. The fields around Lily House turned green again, not the fragile green of beginning, but the deep, confident green of survival. Wildflowers pushed their way through old gravel. The wind no longer howled, it hummed. And life, full, chaotic, beautiful life, bloomed with it. The house woke early now. Breakfast began with Hazel's clatter in the kitchen, and Ruby singing something off-key in the hallway. Ivy, stronger every day, had taken to helping with chores, which mostly meant asking endless questions. June, still quiet, still profound, painted a mural on the barn wall, a scene of hands reaching for sunlight. Piper organized everything from school schedules to chore charts, while Emmy, taller, wiser, and finally more relaxed, worked closely with Grace to prepare for a new round of children arriving soon. Lily House had become more than a home. It had become a haven. And Hank was still there, still waking up every morning and checking the porch light, still fixing leaky faucets and replacing squeaky doors, still reading bedtime stories with voices for each character, still staying. On the first warm Saturday of April, they held a picnic out back beneath the now blossoming elm tree. It had been Piper's idea, of course, complete with hand-drawn invitations for everyone in town. The bench beneath the tree had been cleaned and polished. Flowers braided through the railings. The sign above the porch now read, "Welcome to Lily House, where love stays." Neighbors came bearing dishes and smiles. Kids ran across the grass with wild joy. Volunteers from the clinic, teachers, firemen, even the mayor arrived. The teenage girl who'd come scared and silent last fall now played guitar by the fence. The brothers from the shelter raced Ruby and Hazel around the coop they'd helped build. But the moment everyone remembered came when June stepped up beside the new dedication stone, a smooth granite slab installed just that week, and unveiled her final drawing. It was the first piece she'd done completely in color. It showed the house, yes, and the tree, and all of them arms wrapped around one another. But there, standing slightly apart, yet shining brighter than anything else, was Lily drawn, not with wings this time, but barefoot on the grass, her hand outstretched, touching Hank's. Underneath it, June had written in neat, steady letters, "Because when you love someone, you never really leave them." The crowd fell silent. Then slowly one person began to clap, and then another, until the air filled with the kind of applause that wasn't loud, but honest. That night, after the lanterns dimmed and the last guest had gone, Hank stood at the edge of the porch, hands in his pockets, watching the stars wink to life. Grace rolled up beside him. She wore a wool shawl and a knowing smile. "You built all of this," she said. "No," Hank replied. "We did." She looked toward the house, windows glowing, laughter echoing down the hallway. "Have you forgiven yourself yet?" Hank was quiet. "I don't think forgiveness is a door you open once," he finally said. "I think it's a path, and every day I walk a little further down it." Grace nodded. "And love?" He smiled faintly. "Love is when you realize staying is braver than leaving, and that maybe you don't need to be whole to build something that is." Later, Hank tucked Ivy into bed, her hair now in soft waves, her cough gone. She pulled him down and whispered something in his ear. "Can we call you Dad for real now?" He blinked, his voice caught. "Only if you want to," she grinned. "We all already do. Even Piper. She just pretends she's cooler than that." He laughed. "Then I guess that makes it official." In the quiet moments that followed as he turned out the lights and made his way back to the porch, Hank thought of Lily. Not with the ache that once haunted him, but with warmth. She hadn't left him. She had led him to Grace, to the girls, to Lily House, to the version of himself that had been waiting to live again. And she had whispered to him, not in words, but in every hand he held. Every night he stayed, every laugh that rose from a child's mouth. Stay. Before bed, Hank returned to the elm tree and sat on the bench. The wind stirred the blossoms above. He placed one hand gently on the stone beside him, the one etched with his daughter's name, and the simple words, "She taught us how to stay." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because love, real quiet, lasting love, doesn't need permission to endure. It just does. And somewhere in the night sky above Lily House, a star pulsed a little brighter. Sometimes the family we find is the one that saves us. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, we'd love to know. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far kindness can travel. If you believe in the power of love, second chances, and the simple miracle of staying, feel free to subscribe and join our growing circle of souls who carry hope quietly but proudly. From all of us behind the scenes, thank you. Thank you for sharing your time, your heart, and your presence with us. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay kind.